Everybody, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I would really want to thank you all for being here, all the rectors and the partners that we have been working along for this whole year. And I think for the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, it's really exciting to be launching Istanbul 95. As Yid was explaining this, the whole part of our strategy is to think from a 95 perspective. If you were a politician, if you were a mayor, if you were an urban planner, or if you were any common citizen, what would you do differently in a city in order to cope with all the needs that young children have? And I think when I first started working for the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, it made me realize no matter how important children are for everybody, sometimes we're not really thinking from their perspective. And why is it important to think from a perspective of 95 centimeters? I do want to get back to science, because I think that there are many academics in this room, but I sometimes think we forget to mention some important evidence of what science is telling us. And what happens in the first 1,000 days of a kid, it's very important. And basically, when you think from the brain science, what's happening in the first 1,000 days of life of a kid, which is the 2 first years of a kid's life, is we're basically developing the largest amount of brain connections that we will be having in the rest of our life. And if you think about that and you think, how can I make the best of it? How can I make children have best connections during this period of life so we can have a positive impact in their lives? I think a lot of that happens in the city, and we don't really think about that. We don't think that we are all living in these big cities, and we're not thinking, are cities really creating this thriving environment in order to respond to all of these different connections? Because babies need to connect with their caregivers, of course, they need to connect with their parents, but they need to connect with other children, they need to connect with nature, they need to connect to the public space that they live in, they need to connect to the streets where they're moving around, and they need to connect with all the people surrounding them. So that's when we started thinking how important it was to develop some concrete strategy that would allow us to work with the cities. So again, I just, and Yid also mentioned, investing in early childhood development is the best economic investment we can do, not only because of the economic return we can get from investing in early childhood development, but also because of the social return we can get in investing in early childhood development. And again, there's a lot of evidence, there's even like a Nobel Prize, Heckman, that says investing in early childhood gives us an economic return that's 7 times more. And this, but again, for me, it's not only the economic return that we're talking about. Investing in young children allows us to have better transitions to the school system, it allows us to have better transitions to the employment system, it allows us to have better transitions to creating a safe society. So I really want to emphasize in this, because when we're talking about children, I think this is something that brings the whole society together. It doesn't really matter if we have to work concretely with young children, it has to do with the fact that we all want to have a better society, and that we want to make sure that we can invest in the basis of that society. Again, one of the things and I want to quote one of my favorite phrases that I listened from Enrique Peñalosa, who's a pretty well-known mayor in Bogotá, Colombia. Just for those of you who don't know me, I'm from Ecuador, so I also come from South America. It's a small country, it has almost the same population as Istanbul. Ecuador has 16 million inhabitants, but it's also a very interesting and diverse country. But I want to quote Enrique Peñalosa, because he says, children are like an indicator of a species. If we can build a successful city for children, we will have a successful city for all the people. And I quote Enrique Peñalosa because I think it's a really interesting quote. He's saying, if we think of the needs of children, we're thinking of the needs of everybody else. And it completely makes sense. When you think about the needs of a baby, if you think about the needs of a caregiver going around the city with a young baby, either carrying the baby or going around the city with a stroller or taking any public transportation with a baby, you can think of all the different challenges that you have in order to go around the city with a baby. But these are more or less the same challenges that an older person can have, or than a disabled person may have. So what I'm trying to say here, if we are convinced as mayor, as city planners, as politicians, or as normal citizens, that if we can make the city a better place for children, this will become a better city for everyone. I think we're already making a big progress on our comprehension of what cities need and what people need. I wanted to share with you a couple of examples of what we're doing, and just try to emphasize again on some of the main components that Yit was also mentioning that the whole Urban 95 approach has. So we were mentioning, for example, that we're very interested in working in public space. And of course, in public space in Istanbul concretely, we're working on parks with the 4 municipalities that have joined this project. But I think it's very important to understand that public space goes beyond parks. And for example, one very important public space that many times we don't see are streets. Streets are considered to be the largest public space that we have in cities. But when you ask somebody, and I'm sure that if we would ask a child to define or to give us a definition of what a street is, probably this child will tell us it's the place where cars or buses pass and transit. But in reality, what streets are made for is for people to transit around. And I do want to emphasize this because we realize more and more that the use that we can give to streets can be completely different. And if we think in big cities like Istanbul that it's difficult to find like close public space to all the different neighborhoods, if we would start thinking about streets as a real public space where we can make streets a better place for children, we would make a difference as well. And I'm giving this example because this is, for example, one of the main things that we're working in many Latin American cities. So in Latin America, we're currently working with the Bernard Van Leer Foundation Urban 95 approach. We're working in Bogota, Lima, Sao Paulo, Recife, Boa Vista. Many of these cities are also some of the largest capitals in the region. Just to mention, Sao Paulo has over 18 million inhabitants. Lima is also a very big and huge capital in South America. And some of the work that we're doing there has to do with public space in general, but connected not only playgrounds and parks, but also the work that we can do around streets. And this meaning that when you're talking about public space, you're also trying to connect the population to the different services that need to be connected to young parents and families when you're thinking about early childhood development. And that's interesting, of course, of the work in Istanbul as well, and the work that we have done with TESEV, which has allowed to map and plot the cities and see where are the young children, where are the families with young children living, where in the city do we have the biggest gaps related to services as well, right? Because we also want to map and plot all the different services that young children have to access. So this is one very important component that I think it's very important to share with you. Maybe another important city that I would like to share some of the experience that we're working is India. We're working in a city that's called Bhubaneswar. It's a pretty small city in India. You know, in India the scale is much larger, but in India, again, we are working with all the different components, but India also has lots of challenges from an urban perspective. So there, again, we are also doing a lot of work around the urban space and the public space. There we are redesigning 36 playgrounds, and it's really interesting because this was not conceived to be a space for young children to walk around. But at the same time that we're working with this public space, we are integrating other policies around parenting programs. You heard in Istanbul we're working with the home visiting programs, which I believe it's a very good way to approach especially vulnerable families. But in countries as India, where you have a much larger scale of vulnerable families, what we're also trying to do is how can we use public space to do some of this coaching and parenting activities? Is there any way that we can use different messages around the city in order to promote some of the key messages that we want to promote in the parent coaching? And just to mention some of the behaviors that we're trying to promote in all the different cities that we're working around the world have to do with improving connections and relationships among caregivers and children. And I think this is very important. When you understand the overall of Urban 95, of course we want to think how can we make cities a better place for young children to live in. But basically we're also thinking how can we make cities become better places for children and their caregivers to connect, to interact. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do with all the home visits in Istanbul is how can we help caregivers to have healthier connections, positive connections with their children, but also when we're working in the other countries, we're thinking in general, which are the different places where caregivers and people can connect with young children? How can we make these positive connections really happen? How can we avoid young children be in constant exposition of violence? How can we expose them to more positive life experiences? And one of the things that we have done there has to do with promote many different activities. For example, one of the activities that we are promoting again in some of the cities that we're working in Latin America is storytelling. And storytelling, of course, usually creates a very positive connection. And what is really interesting is when you work in many favelas in Brazil, you don't necessarily have like high levels of literate people. Okay, in many families, you might even have illiterate parents that have to tell stories to their children. So one of course you would think, oh, but in order to do some storytelling you need to read a book. Not necessarily. You can also do storytelling without necessarily reading a book. You're just like talking about